Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're going to be talking about a bunch of things as they come on my mind. I've been thinking about the response to the appearance I had on This is Revolution on third and fourth positionism. I am thinking about some conversations I've had with the good liberal folks in my life. I am thinking about the way in which I'm seeing projection upon the internet still functioning as things continue with this pandemic to serve as both an outlet for and a distraction from the alienation people are feeling right now. Common themes on this channel, but ones that I want to dig deep into a little bit more. And it's been interesting because I work in an office now for the first time in years. The last time I worked in an office was around 2002. I've been a teacher for a long time in many different countries, and most of my life has been on my feet, roaming around a classroom like a piranha, teaching like a spaz. And I know from the energy you get from this that you probably don't think that that's how I teach, but I'm locked in a chair right now, definitionally. I thought about getting a camera that would allow me to move around, but then the whole blog aspect of it becomes a lot more difficult. Plus, I do too many interviews on this channel. But because of the nature of my work changing, I have a lot more time to interact with my coworkers, and there's always been locker talk at my teaching jobs when we would go and huddle in the food room. But I've been kind of getting a feel for where people are as far as like what good liberal opinion is and how distant I've become from it. And what's interesting is my proxies now are as educated as me. In my prior jobs, most of the teachers that I worked with have BAs and some educational, postgrad work, but only in education. And I don't mean to confirm to this stereotype, but there is a sense in which educational higher academia is mostly practical and yet also very theoretical. It is not rigorous in the same way that like getting your MA in English proper or sciences. And I can say that from experience in one and experience of friends in another. But it is rigorous in the sense that you're busy all the time and it keeps you busy. And in fact, if anything, it shuts down your ability to process things in a lot of ways. All right. But I'm working now with people who have that education, but they also have, like me, a lot of them have MAs, MFAs in their subject area. We're kind of all subject area specialists, or the people have taught for like 20 years. And I'm listening to them talk to me about what they want to teach their students. And I'm realizing how many things that I now view as myths that I even probably said in my 20s are super commonplace, and why that's actually kind of a bad thing. All right. Now, I say this is a contrast to the discourse, unquote, on social media, where things are more extreme. People tend to take more extreme political stances. And the politics there are kind of, frankly, reactionary to good liberal opinion. All right. It's kind of the shadow id of that opinion right now. And even when you see it manifested in blue check world, and I'm going to talk about how bad blue check world actually is, that what I'm learning is there's a lot of people who, at one hand, say they no longer believe in progress, say they have a problem with capitalism, say that they are tired of the way things are, but shame people for voting for the Democrats, think that for not voting for the Democrats, excuse me, or shame people for voting for the Democrats. Actually, I see both, because not everyone is. I'll get to the why people on Twitter in a minute. Not everyone involved is liberal in the political sense. So I had a colleague ask me about, if it was okay to teach the students that, America was one of the first countries where the idea of a nation was not based on a cultural or ethnic proxy, like in France, like in Italy, like in Germany, was his exact examples. And I pointed out to him that the only nation that he's mentioned in that group that where the coalition of nationhood seems organic is France. That and he was like, yeah, but when I talk about the republics, I don't mean the French state. And I'm like, yeah, but the end of medieval period was a consolidation of the French modern state. The standardization of the language, from the erasure of things like the remnants of Gallic in Brittany are the specific Italio-French dialects of Provence. The hostility towards areas of borderlands like Alsace-Lorraine. These were all modern. All right. And then with the other two countries he mentioned, they weren't consolidated as political entities exactly until the end of the 19th century. And that you have to believe in the myth that this was a unified ethnic group, that there was clearly something it meant to be Italian between Sicily to the north. Similar with Spain, although Spain is I said Spain is probably the area where you have the most extremely obvious version of the consolidation of a country, because it was also a consolidation of religion, and immediately turned into empire, within 50 years. And he just looked at me like I was insane. When I said that none of these nations, that most of their senses of ethnicity, while they're rooted in communities that existed for sometimes thousands of years, in all of the cases that I can think of, including ones in like East Asia, the modern process of nation building is synthetic. Like, it is about the erasure of certain small cultural differences and small cultural group. That's what nation building is. And this idea that some nations did it just organically because they were a unified national polity seems like a total, they were unified national culture. It just needed to unify into a singular polity because it was clear that they were all similar, seems fundamentally false. But in the context of the 19th century narrativization of itself and why this was going on, there was really no other way to do this. And yeah, someone's bringing in a chat that this is what Fanon says. This is more obvious in terms of Africa, Latin America, where there's what I like to call the paradox of decolonialization. Chinua Achebe writes about this the best, and the African writer in the English language. What's horseshit, Erica? Mm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, you're agreeing with me. I was just responding. I don't when I just get an expletive outburst, I'm like, what? Which side of this this debate are you calling horseshit? Um, sorry for those listening along and not following the comments. Um, nations are completely synthetic entities, and the idea that you could consolidate them into a Pan-African nation or a Pan-European nation is the dream of centralization. It's actually something interesting, though, because this is something that historically Leninism and Marxist-Leninism picked a variety, but this goes back to Lenin, resisted because they said that the only people who thought this were small micronations who were not historically important. But this assumes a lot. After all these nations were collective and micronations. The people who posited the response to the national polity tend to come out of multi-ethnic empires, of which the United States was one. And this is the other end of my point to my good liberal friend, is that all these were empires. They were all designed to be all these big nations. And that, in effect, what we consider colonialism starts at home. There is a sense with the paradox of decolonization that Chinua Achebe talks about, like, why do we write in English? Why do we embrace the nation state? Dusty, your examples against me actually prove the rule. The Malayan nation is just like most pre-modern empires. Pre-modern empires were not national. They were usually ethno-confessional, in the fact that, you know, the ethnicity was defined by the confession, not even the language, and they didn't view themselves as one unified people. That was true for the Holy Roman Empire. That was true for for the Ottoman Empire. That's true. That was true for the French Empire. Right. But the idea of the conflation of nation with empire is kind of a modern thing. Like this idea, like the U.S. was interesting, as was Mexico, as was New Spain. Okay, I'm sorry to disagree with you. It's, again, it's hard to get context from these short comments sometimes. As was New Spain, had various reactions to how to carve both an empire and a nation into one synthetic unity, and the idea of the nation state, particularly in the settler colonial regions, and not just in the Anglo ones, which everyone on the left seems to focus on. You know, the embrace of this in the Catholic, you know, New Spain was kind of a reversion back to ethno-confessionalism, but with the idea of the La Cosmic Raza, the idea of the cosmic race, that you could, by intermarrying, you could become part of this race. In the US, there was two attempts to do this. One, you know, and the biggest one was the doubling down on whiteness, you know, a category that had emerged from Europeanness with the emergence of the Portuguese slave trade, right? Now, it is false to say that there was nothing like this in antiquity. The Greeks had notions of, you know, black, Greek, and yellow being German, you know. But there was nothing like the way we think of it as like biological race. It's just, but it's not true that like that no one ever noticed. It was just not a super big category distinction. It's what's so rarely mentioned when you read the writings of ancients. But that's how we handled it. Kind of inclusion exclusion category. Like instead of being totally inclusive, but with weird, default casts and this, that, and the other, which is what actually happens in the Spanish and Catholic parts of settler colonial America. What we do basically is story of whiteness, and it's well understood. But this idea that we were somehow different from these European national projects is still kind of a myth. Yeah. This is a good point. Similar to how colorism works in the Arab world, there's no Arabic term for race. There's only skin color and ethnic group. Yep. And the focus on skin color becomes a slightly bigger deal, right? Actually, in the Islamic caliphates, in the beginnings of the transatlantic empire, which is actually kind of haunting, because when you read like Ibn Khaldun, he starts talking about like skin color typologies in a way that I think the Portuguese picked up on. But the Arab world never developed it into a fully instantiated concept of race. When so much of that was developed, it was developed from Europe. It's similar to Asia. Like I'd always tell people, you know what the word for Asian is in Asia? It is Asia. That's what it was in Korea and Japan anyway. And that means it's not a indigenous concept, right? That it's imported from us. You find lipstick traces, like that all over the world. And this leads me to a very difficult situation when trying to explain this like good American liberals, that it's not just that the American dream is a lie. It's that most of the edifice that even the American dream is responding to, that we think we're different from, is also an invented tradition of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And if you travel the world, you really see this. And it actually, ironically, makes a lot of the discourse about anti-racism in the United States almost colonialist. I mean, I don't mean that that's maybe not right, but it does impose a framework that actually doesn't entirely fit with the frameworks of ethno difference across the world, even though it rhymes. There's discussion of colorism in the other world. There's also colorism in Latin America. And this does not work the same way as race does in the US, although it's definitely analogous and definitely comes from the same time period. So when you're trying to say someone's to break free from the lies of the American dream, but you still accept all the 17th, 18th, 19th century justifications for the polities we know today and naturalize them, what do you think the result's going to be? What's the difference there? I think this becomes kind of a discourse model that it's hard to break down. But that's one of the more complicated ones that my friend asked. Another one, this is related to science, was we were talking about ADHD. And I said, while I totally believe that ADHD is an actual pathology that's developed in the modern world, my friend was like, well, I'm the same person actually, and this actually offended them. Was like, well, no, but the criterion is just getting better. We're just getting better at diagnosis. And I was like, one, the criterion for psychological disorders are symptomic. They're not pathological, meaning, or in very few cases are they pathological, meaning we have to define them by their manifestations and symptoms, not by their pathology. Now, it's true for some other diseases, so it's not unique to mental health. 2, some of these conditions are overdetermined, meaning they have multiple causal factors in any treatment we do, because we use symptoms to devise treatment like most doctors do, and because we don't have pathologies you could actually discover for a lot of these, or at least not ones that we understand sufficiently enough yet, that we're often treating complex and differently caused phenomenon with the same treatment. And 3, rates of ADHD in particular are culturally variant. And I just got told I was, being anti-scientific. And then I said, well, what you're arguing is because we don't know what these rates were in the past, because we're comparing apples to oranges, and I point out executive function where we do understand this. And I pointed out the fact that like giving stimulants to distracted children as a way to undistract them was figured out in the 1920s. That there is no way to say if it's growing, if it's a condition that's a response to different factors of modern life, or if we're just getting better at diagnosis. Saying any one of those 3 things definitively is an argument from ignorance. And they got mad at me. And I said, I wish that I thought it was just diagnostic criteria, but I don't think so. I do think some of it is the fact that we push certain kinds of education down the ladder to increasingly younger students as a way of dealing with the fact that having kids sit for that long in a didactic environment is not really normal for people whose brains have not completely developed in that way. Furthermore, there is all kinds of incentives to overdiagnose issues, and it's not just big pharma. That's part of it. But we tend to reduce complex social phenomena into simple things that we can say explain the dysfunctions of our life. This was Christopher Lash's critique of populism, at least it was in his early books, that he said the tendency to reduce things down into simple economic actors without dealing with the complexity of economic systems leads to conspiracy thinking, leads to outrageous politics, and then what a dynamic that he didn't call this, but I actually see, which is what I call a high investment religious dynamic, or you might call it the cult dynamic, where you need simple answers that are definitive and they require a lot of you to hold. This is appealing because it is an explanatory mechanism, but also these groups tend to expand fast and then die out. This is actually what's going on in a lot of Twitter dynamics, but whatever. When it comes to something like this, we have a complex social phenomena. We can't really say if it's totally modern or if it's just our diagnostic criterion. But that also means we can't really discount those theories either. And in the case of something like ADHD, since it's culturally variant, one has to wonder, right? One has to wonder if it's either a particular societal trigger or it's a case of the pathology was invented by us for things in our own society. It's very hard to deal with. Most models are necessarily simplified. That's why they're models. That does not mean they're true or untrue. This is a whole map is not the territory problem. But the executive function studies and the ties to dopamine addiction are pretty well understood. So there's that. So, and talking with good liberal people, we've determined two things: that there is a tacit Whiggish belief in science, that doesn't really deal with the history of science. It takes science as a neutral good, and there's a tacit belief that even though American exceptionalism is bad, and even though the synthetic nation has not worked out, that the United States was unique as a synthetic nation, and that we were an embodiment of liberalism, and thus also the failure of liberalism in ways that are not true for Europe and the rest of the world. The difference between this and my own theory is that what we see in places that were colonized are just closer to us, and we can see it happening because we now have modern recording techniques. That this happened in almost all instantiations of the unification of nations into economic productive polities. But what does this have to do with fiddling while the world burns? Because that's the bigger question. Why do I see so many of these internet discourses as contributing to that, as, you know, not just as being a response to it? Because yes, I mean, you know, as I said this week, whenever I want to feel better about the insanity and inaneness of left Twitter, I just go watch blue check Twitter and conservative Twitter. Because Twitter is the id of not the population. That's false. It's the id of the media producers. It's the id of the punditry. Twitter is used to spread punditry. That's what it's for. All right. That's why people engage in it. When I started doing a vlog on a YouTube, I found myself this is an interesting point. I am of two minds of this. I'm going to share this with the audience who's not here. Dusty 48. I'm a big fan. I'm not a big fan of taking orders from history. It's so context specific. It's a nice stories and shows us how humans behave to stimuli, but nothing more. This is actually a good point. I don't believe it in that clearer way. But I do think there's a way in which people over-determine, to use a word that I hate, or they under-determine their analysis from history. History is not, and so far cannot be, a science. It is mostly narratives about the way humans behave in groups to stimuli. I totally agree with that. Attempts to make it scientific tend to turn it into statistics or sociology. And sociology has many, many problems, and we could get into that too. But there is a sense in which, if you totally block out history for either contingency, which was popular in the 70s and comes back up every now and then, or for political will, which is like implicit in every Adam Curtis documentary and half the things that people derive from Mark Fisher and a lot of Leninists, frankly, even though they don't totally admit it. Their complaints about economism, and they're often valid, are often replaced with political determinism, as if this is totally emergent from, political will is a collective agent that you can just control. And what you notice with political determinists is they actually tend to become more and more dogmatic over time, because things that they don't predict happen over and over and over again. I've been thinking more and more about what drives this. What drives this turn on social media. And I will say that when someone makes a generalization about humanity that cannot be put in terms of quanta, all right, in terms of math, it is very hard to know if that generalization is real. And even the math has its problems because you can lie with good math, actually, without faking the math. And then people say math don't lie. Well, numbers do not lie, but how one computes and factors them definitely can be. And you read racecraft for the way this is used on racial statistics and the way it is builds race. You can use this. You can use this in the way we talk about poverty reduction and the way states talk about that. But it is amazing how predictable some of these trends are. So I was involved in like left media for like 2012, 2013. And the people that I was involved with kind of presaged every trend you saw on the internet. I mean, it was a small coterie of people, some of which became famous, some of which didn't. And they flirted with left communism, and then they flirted with neo-Kautskyism. Then a few of them became heavily invested in defending the Chinese state because, quote, it is a conspiracy to tell us that communism is not possible to say that no communist societies currently exist. Yes, the Field Sisters book. And I literally saw them move from step to step to step to step. And they had come out of generic philosophy, postmodernism, etc. And I say they, it was the other editors at the North Star, with a couple of exceptions. And they were really good gauges for the way the discourse was going to go. Because people want to replace a failing belief system with an already existing proven failing, belief system that's not going to fail them. You look at China and you see a country that has a government, or at least part of it does think it's transitioning to socialism, whether or not. I think that's unarguably true. I also think you have to deal with what it's actually achieved and how it's managed to do it. And it's hard to say that the way you get rid of something is to do more of the thing you want to get rid of. And this has been an argument from socialists for a long time in a very vulgar sense. We need to do the thing we want to kill so that the world undoes itself. A lot of this seems like the hope that entropy will basically do the work for you. And so these leads people to discourse theories and stuff that aren't really changing much. In the meantime, liberals are still yelling at people for not voting for Hillary Clinton because of the Texas abortion law, as if we know how things would have turned out differently if Clinton had won, because in almost no mathematical scenario that I look at does a Clinton victory lead to a Democratic Senate. So you can't say that certain things would have gone a whole lot better just by an election win. But this is a simple myth, and it's a smug myth. Like, this is why I'm beginning to really push this cultural narcissism narrative, because in the lack of our ability to produce communities that are highly connected, we do seem to view ourselves in the extension of the ideas we adopt. That our identification with liberalism is an identification of personal worth. And so people who accept it also must be inherently wrong or bad. Who reject it extremely. And I don't think this works. I think this is a very damaging way to go about the world, but it leads to smugness where at one sense you're complaining, like with Biden's vaccine mandate, we're complaining that the people fighting it are just keyboard warriors, while also talking about how January 6th was a true threat to American democracy. You can't really risk both things. That belief seems more about confirming your own superiority and your own righteousness than it does about actually fixing political polity or even dealing with the problems of the vaccine. And by I say the problems of the vaccine, I do not mean the problems of vaccine efficacy. I mean the problems of why anti-vax ideology has developed and why the communication from many of the scientific authorities in the United States has not helped, even when it's been honest. And its honesty has always been colored by the political dictates of the administration, because none of our institutions can get around their political dependency. This is quite bad because there are things like, for example, suggesting people under 5 wear a mask, which the WHO, the World Health Organization, has said was probably unwise, or at least inefficacious. And even my partner, who works with epidemiologists and pharmacologists and stuff for a living, tried to defend the CDC against the WHO, basically because of political instincts. And I pointed out to her that I was like, we're just suggesting something we don't have randomized trials for, and we don't know how to do randomized trials because to do so in this context would probably be immoral. But you could do randomized case studies to justify it, and we haven't done that. We just made a decision arbitrarily against the wishes of the WHO that confirm with basically political prejudice, because this has been politicized. And the wisdom of the crowd, as I've talked about before, actually is damaged by politicization, because we view politics as an extension of ourselves. And anything we view as an extension of ourselves, we cannot be particularly fair with. This brings me to this obsession that people have with third and fourth positionism. I study it. I do think it's dangerous on the margin. I think it's actually a real threat in Europe. But I honestly think in some ways the obsession with it is a way to feel the rush of historical importance without really doing a whole lot to change the situation. Because these are people who are infiltrating things, and to be fair, sometimes they are, actually. And a lot of the complete wildness you see with the anti-left socialists and Marxists that come out of this. Okay, third positionism, according to its own definition, was beyond left and right. It was, the first position was liberalism. The second position was Marxism, which was a development from liberalism and deviation from it. The third positionism takes the base level, the pre-position society, the kind of organic reactionaryism, organic society, and tries to combine it with the benefits of liberalism and Marxism. That's why it was called third positionism. Fourth positionism is trying to do that without racialization. So one of the things that the third positionists did was they focus on racial organic units as a proxy for nations, and nations as an organic whole. Fourth positionism argues for cultures as an organic whole, not nations. and sees biological racialization as too modern. This is a good example. Coburn became a crank, but he did point out that the left always acts as if Nazis are around the corner. It gives us a fake sense of importance. That's totally true. Unfortunately, a lot of people who say that tend to also try to make opportunistic inroads into right-wing populism and campism. Coburn definitely did. That's why he took Ron Unt's money, etc. So you had this idea of, united against the center. So as a person I know, actually, and know somewhat personally, Keith Preston always argued for is a united against the center stance, a kind of a popular front against liberalism. Now I don't like the popular front against. I haven't thought the popular front's worked out for anybody historically, frankly. United fronts are also, have done a little better. And this is a person who believes in organizational pluralism. You don't kick factions out. You don't kick people you dislike out. Just because you disagree with them, you battle it out politically within the system, and you either accept the results or you don't. No, I would not consider Platypus fourth positionism. Whose money? Unz. They took a bunch of money, but Unz was one of them. Ron Unz, yes. But in another way, what we've seen is the center and the center left and right have survived all this. For all the predictions of the end of Wonktopia 5 years ago, we haven't seen the reforms. And the left became cheerleaders for Biden just for throwing it out rhetorically while none of it was happening. And then the people who criticize it posit, kinds of third partyists made up of activists are, coalitions of people against the center without who don't really share that much, or they posit a counter elite by siding with the different petty bourgeois than the kind of petty bourgeois labor aristocrat grifter, the thing that people accuse on the left. And you also see the same thing that you saw with liberals. The left started shaming people for not doing what they wanted, and particularly parts of it started shaming other parts for not doing what they wanted, the same way liberals did when they don't do well. In short, instead of trying to grow and make themselves more appealing, or take information about why they may or may not be popular, or just deal with the fact that the system may have shut them out in a very real way, in which case they've been actually used cynically to keep people invested in a political system that is sclerotic. All those are possibilities. They have blamed their cohort. They have blamed themselves but always with an exception for their specific person. Oh, I see through all this, but you don't. Let me tell you, friends, I see a lot of traits that are negative, but I don't necessarily see through all this. I can see negative trends, not positive ones. And it's not that there aren't positive ones out there. But when I say I can see negative trends, not positive ones, I can see things that are blocks, but I can't see all the possibilities on the horizon. No individual can. Anyone who tries to sell you that they can, probably selling you snake oil. But pretending that this is not an electoral gain, this immediate thing is going to fix society or change the outcome, particularly when, for example, the crisis of the law is something that the Democrats have participated in this entire time. First, by over-relying on the judiciary in a way that built an apparatus that conservatives could then take advantage of, but also on the fact that they won't do anything about it now because they don't feel like they can. Well, why can't they? And then should we on the outside want them to? Just because we systemically agree with parts of what they say. Dusty's got a point here. This was my point the other day. America is becoming more like Europe and wants to fix America because the same problems exist in socialized Europe, and they totally do. I have other thoughts. I've been thinking about gender and feminism a lot lately, and the way that it's been utilized as a way to expand capital, but also a way in which like the people responding to it often actually are revanchist in what they're doing and justifying their own biases and stuff by focusing only on the girl boss aspect of it. But maybe another time. But the discourse right now, whatever that is, the way we participate in social media has been both a source of radicalization, but ironically a place that has removed people's ability to really do much because it's not been built in any sound community. And Americans are so cloistered in their decaying hegemonic core that they don't see that the problems that exist here exist the places they idolize too. And the people trying to tell them that, oh, if we're a bit more like Europe, we'll fix it. Well, it might be more humane. I mean, I do think in many ways, like being in the European part of the transatlantic superpolity has allowed for some more humaneness. But the problems are still there. They're not going away either. We see that from Afghanistan to international market competition to the fact that when borders are proving themselves the least effective and useful is when people believe in them the most. And this is even true of social democrats who want to cynically get ahead of things. Who's like, well, we have to, we can't just scream open borders. Well, that was always like the people saying that who also believe that you can have a strong social democratic state have always been kind of lying. But it's also showing a real issue that we're not dealing with. And that is that the physical world is changing a way that is making these old ideas from the 19th century less and less viable. But we've heard people say the nation state was going to end for forever. Yeah, Dusty's been on fire today in the comment section. I've noticed this in Israel. I've noticed this in Australia as also, where there's lockdowns, and Israel where there was both a vaccine, which was accessed early, and there is socialized medicine. None of this have mattered. So the idea that there's going to be one neat economic fix without changing massive parts of society in the system seems to me just a pipe dream. And fixating on these small fringe elements seems to me, even when those fringe elements may be legitimately dangerous or have legitimately terrible ideas, seems to be a way to not look at the elephant in the room. The two ideas that I think people need to gather more is it's not just affluence that creates a conservative temperament. A conservative temperament can be filled with all kinds of ideologies, guys. It doesn't necessarily mean conservatism qua US and Europe. But that when you are afraid, you turn to the things that seem immediately accessible to you and what the people belong and what fills in the narrative of your immediate life. And the nation state's been part of that in the 19th and 20th century in the extreme. That's not going to help us. It's not a tradition that is going to probably help us get through all this. We're going to have to, for all of our use, we're going to a use of invented traditions on the left ourselves. We have to go beyond that now. And like in the 19th century, like in the 18th century, like in every century, the future we're confronting is different than the one of the past. We'll play act the past until we figure something out. Unfortunately, that's what people tend to do. It's an observation Marx makes offhand in the Brumaire that I think is unfortunately kind of apt. But why do people ask what you can't know? All right. There's a real epistemic, and I get mad at this question. What does going beyond look like? No one knew what capitalism was going to be, how it was going to look when they start to build it. You can't know. Right. That's why the traditions of all dead generations drape like on the nightmare on the brains of the living, because we can't know the future. We don't even know if there is one. We have to be more willing to criticize the myths that we believe. That's what my point was about the good liberal people in the beginning of this diatribe today. Yeah. Questions suggest answers. The hard part is getting close enough to the right question, scientific and historical. And that is absolutely true. Sometimes some questions suggest answers that aren't there. Anyway, I am going to finish. I think this is a good point to round up for the day. I want to thank my audience. You guys were great today. You gave me a lot to play off of, even though it meant that I didn't cover everything I was going to, but I'm going to do another one of these this week. Announcements for the channel. I don't know that I'm going to have a guest this week because of my day job. Had called me in at night for something, and so I had to reschedule a guest, and I don't know if that's going to be scheduled for this week or another week. I am trying to podcast less and do more here on this channel and with TIR. But so, you know, there's been some weeks where I've literally podcasted every day of the week, but I am trying to focus more on content here. So we'll see what happens there. But I at least have one more stream like this. Thanks. Coming up this week. I want to thank new Khan-e Kahanan, Habib Rahman. Thank you for sponsoring this content. And go back and like and subscribe. If you guys would share this too, I want this idea to be out there. And I know I don't have the most palatable. A lot of what I say is, hey, you know those things you believe in that probably aren't true. Have a nice day. Bye. But some people really seem to be crying out for that these days. And I don't want people to find despair. You know, I want them to feel like they're breaking through into something. That at least they can start to see what maybe we could do, even if we don't have exact answers for anything. I hope you all have a good day. Go touch some grass. I did this morning. It's good for you. Actually, I spent 2 whole days away from my computer. What does breaking through look like? Breaking through looks like breaking through the systemic stuff just looks like analysis. It's what we're building with that is what I can't tell you until we actually start to build it. But to build something new, one has to admit that a lot of the answers one has tinkered with may be the basis of something that we build upon, but it's not going to be where we find the answers for the future. I wish I could tell you easily where those answers were. I am putting some in political economy and a lot more in complexity theory. But until then, yeah, go touch some dirt, grass, whatever you have. The fact we have grass here in Utah actually is weird, and I think kind of wrong. But anyway, get outside is the moral of this story. Go hang out with some humans and some animals in a socially responsible way. All right, take care.